have a guest speaker who has come all the way from Rochester, New York. She recently comes from Greece. And we were very excited to have her. Dr. Lainey Friedman-Ross is a pediatrician and a philosopher. And also, I want to add, it's not in her bio, but she's a Yankees fan, so proceed accordingly. And we decided yesterday, part-time stand-up comedian, maybe be the judge. She comes to us from the University of Rochester, where she is the Dean's Professor and inaugural chair of the Department of Health Humanities and Bioethics, which she basically created from scratch, is my understanding. And the director of the Center for Bioethics at the University of Rochester School of Medicine. And she also holds appointments in the Department of Philosophy. We have some philosophers here today, as well as pediatrics and neurology. So she is a clinical pediatrician by training and has some very interesting stories from all of her years of taking care of patients. She is originally from Long Island, New York, which is a great place to be from. All the best people from there. She completed her undergraduate degree at Princeton, which is, I guess, a decent place, kind of. And then she got her medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania, and then she went to a really great place, Yale University, for her PhD, because she just keeps collecting degrees. And she has published too many articles to even count, but it's in the hundreds. She has published as an author or co-authored 5 books, which you should all definitely read, and has presented at multiple conferences, et cetera, and is considered to be an authority on several subjects, including but not limited to pediatric ethics, decision-making, which we'll talk about today, transplantation, and racial and gender equity in clinical medicine and academics. And she has published on a wide variety of these topics, including COVID vaccination for pediatric patients and adolescents, which is a fairly controversial topic. I think she likes controversy. It's what I'm getting. Previously, before the University of Rochester, she was at the University of Chicago for many years. And is it McLean? Did I say that right? The McLean Center for Ethics there. So welcome to Dr. Ross. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. And thank you, Kyle, for the Diet Coke. So I'll be able to talk. So I'm actually excited to give this talk because I think this is a really important thing. So here my outline is that I'm going to explore the concept of the triadic clinician-patient-parent relationship in pediatric decision-making in healthcare. I'm then going to consider whether the best interest standard is an appropriate standard for guidance and intervention or both, and I'll explain. I'm going to use the case of Charlie Gard in the UK to compare how we use those principles here in the US and the UK to make it clear what we really mean by best interest. And then I'm going to explore the pediatric decision-making where there's more than one child in the family. Because one of the projects that I'm currently working on is the whole issue of siblings and what sibling obligations may exist, both as children and as adults in healthcare. So this is my favorite slide. And I think this explains why you just can't take adult medical ethics, which is what we often teach in medical schools, and you just can't downsize it. So in medical ethics for adult, we start with the dyadic relationship. We talk with the doctor and the patient, actually them in a room, and there's going to be sort of a tone of confidentiality. Now, the fact is, in 2025, it's rarely just a doctor. It's often a doctor and nurses and PAs and team members and trainees. And patients often aren't alone. They often come with families and things of that sort. So I understand that. But in a sense that the crux of the medical ethics is the doctor-patient relationship. So pediatrics is different because there's 3 parties. The doctor, the patient, and there's a parent. And so that's going to change it. And even though the patient, the child, the parent we have to think of it always in this triadic relationship. We'll see why that makes life complicated. In adults, the presumption is always that adults have decisional capacity. They can be proven not to, but we presume that they have it. In pediatrics, by contrast, we presume they don't have it. Now, there are exceptions, and there are exceptional circumstances. So, for example, they're allowed to without parental consent. Certain states have different laws about what we call specialized consent statutes, whether about mental health, contraception, and things of that sort. I'm not going to be getting into that today. But in general, we presume that children lack it. In adults, if you lose decisional capacity, you have a surrogate decision maker. You, as a competent adult, can choose who your decision maker are. If you don't choose a decision maker, every state has what they call a surrogacy ladder who will speak for you. So often first a legal guardian. If you don't have a legal guardian, it'll be your spouse, and it can be your adult children and your parents and things like that. And every state has a list. But an adult has the right to make a decision who they want to speak for them. In contrast, in pediatrics, parents are presumed to be the decision maker. And that's true even if one of the parents has left the child, unless there's actually been a court order, both parents have equal say. Next thing is that in the adult world, adult surrogates are expected to follow. First, they're supposed to do by like a living will or an advance directive exactly what I tell you I want you to say for me. Haven't specified that, and you're supposed to use what's called the principle of substituted judgment, which is to say, what do you think Lainey would do in this circumstance? And if you don't know that, then you're supposed to go to what do we think is in Lainey's best interest. In pediatrics, in some ways, irrelevant whether a kid is getting a perfect fit. The decision-making tool has always been that parents are supposed to act in their quote child's best interest. And I've served on enough American Academy of Pediatric Committee statements, and every single statement, it always begins with focused on the child's best interest. Even when we get to the American College of Medical Genetics, every statement starts with, we start at the child's best interest. I'm going to disabuse you of that. We actually never think about the child's best interest, all right? And I'm going to come back to it. Adults have the right to accept all treatment, including life-saving treatment. Parents and decision makers for their children have wide discretion, but not absolute discretion. So parents are allowed to make decisions, but at some point, if it's going to violate the child's basic needs, the parents have been found to be either abusive or neglectful. So there's a limit to what parents can do for their children, in contrast to what you can do for yourself, or even what your surrogate can do for an adult. And the last thing that's really, really different is that, again, if you think about that isolated doctor-patient relationship, that cone of silence, that confidentiality, there are exceptions, like public health exceptions, reporting of STIs and things of that sort. But in pediatrics, what do we even mean by confidentiality or privacy? It's from whom and to whom. Do parents have a right to confidentiality against their kid? Children have any rights to privacy from their parents and things of that sort. It's a mess when they're 3, right? 3 people can keep a secret as long as one is dead type of thing. So you're really in this stress about what we mean by privacy and confidentiality. So although almost every medical ethics course you'll ever take starts with the competent adult, and it ought to, we can't just sort of downsize. And that's why I think it's such an important table to think about. The framework I use for pediatric decision-making comes from a book, Buchanan and Brott, written in 1989. At least some of you were born at that time. And they have 4 principles. They have the underlying ethical principles, the surrogate principle, who is going to be the appropriate decision maker, the guidance principle, what principles should guide them, and the intervention principle, when should the state intervene. Let's just look at what they did in this book, because it's really quite good. They said in adults, start with self-determination, or what we call autonomy, and well-being, what we talk about like best interest, or beneficence. In pediatrics, note the first thing, they swap. Instead of going self-determination, then well-being, they start with well-being and then go to self-determination. So in pediatrics, beneficence, or doing what's best for the child, more important than worrying about autonomy. But they add a third factor. They add parental interests. All of a sudden you're saying parents are supposed to act in their child's best interest, but parents are also allowed to consider their own interests. So one question is, why are parents allowed to consider their own interests? And the answer is because parents actually aren't fiduciaries for their children. They don't actually have to do what's best. They are allowed to have lives of their own and are allowed to consider their own interests. Now that's my case to somebody else. So really important that in pediatrics, the parents are allowed to consider, and they're allowed to have a life of their own. And we'll come back to that and what that really means as we talk about decision-making in pediatrics. Who's the appropriate decision maker? As I've already gone through in the last slides, adults get to choose. Pediatrics start with the assumption that it's parents and it's both. The guidance principle, again, in adults, we start with this advanced directive, then substituted judgment, then best interest. In peds, we start with best interest, although again, in the next 3 slides after this, I'm going to say not really. And then finally, intervention principle. When should the state intervene? In adults, it's if your surrogate is acting in bad faith. One of the cases that haunts me to this day is a case where 4 children looked at me in the eye and said, "Dad wouldn't want this, do it." Right? And so you're sort of sitting there saying, you're acting in bad faith, but how am I going to go to court and say, 4 loving children want to keep their dad alive and we think they're acting in bad faith, right? It's not going to win. So, but in general, that's the only time you can intervene when adult surrogates are acting in bad faith. In pediatrics, you can intervene when you think the parents are abusive or neglectful. There are special circumstances. So historically, like you couldn't have one child serve as a bone marrow donor or donate an organ to another without actually going to court. And sometimes when parents are making decisions that are outside of the norm, whether it would get legal or third-party intervention, sometimes nearly an ethics committee, but sometimes even going to the courts, as they said. So very different how we guide decision-making in adults and how we intervene between adults and pediatrics. So let's get to the heart of where I'm going to go. We really hold parents to a best interest. And happy to take responses, but here's the case. Mr. and Mrs. D are the parents of David, a well-appearing 6-week-old boy. During their first well baby visit, you learn that Mr. D had retinoblastoma, it's an eye cancer as a child, and had his left eye removed. So what you need to know about retinoblastoma, it's familial. It's actually autosomal dominant, which means if you have a parent that has it, 50% every child will have it. Only has to be in one parent. This gene was first described in the mid-1980s. And Mrs. D says they were offered genetic testing in utero and they refused, and they still don't want genetic testing. And so one question is, why might Mr. and Mrs. D refuse prenatal testing? Do you want to pop an answer, or should I keep talking? Why might they refuse prenatal testing?
It's not gonna change what they do prenatally.
Absolutely, and in fact, by doing prenatal testing, unless they use now, we do non-invasive prenatal testing, but historically we would do amniocentesis, which has its own risk. So if it's not going to change anything I'm going to do during the pregnancy, why do it? Absolutely. So the big difference between neonatal and prenatal is that in prenatal it might not change anything, but when we get to the neonate, the fact is that if you have a family history. So when I was a resident, we didn't have the RB1 gene. And so what we would do is we would actually take these kids every 3 months to do an eye exam until they were about 3, and then do it every 6 months. And then at age 5, tell the parents, good news, your child doesn't have the retinoblastoma gene, your child doesn't have retinoblastoma, your child's, in a sense, free from that type of concern. Now that we have the gene, 50% of the kids don't have to go through an eye exam. So an eye exam doesn't seem like a big deal, except what you don't realize is that once a baby becomes like 9 months old, they wiggle and a lot. So in order to be able to do a really good eye exam to find cancer at its earliest stages back in the retina, you actually have to put them under some degree of anesthesia. And anesthesia has real risks. So if you ask me what's best for a child, the answer is get the gene test, and 50% of them never need another eye exam. And 50% of them will do it, because what's really important is we pick up the eye cancer as soon as possible, both to prevent mortality and also to prevent morbidity, possibly even save the vision in the child. So what's in this 6-week-old David's best interest? I would argue that getting genetic testing, okay? So parents now refuse genetic testing. I've explained everything I've just explained to you. And the question is, so what do I do? The parents are refusing. And there may be reasons that they're not exploring with me. They may say, well, we're afraid that we'll lose our health insurance coverage. And the answer is GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Disclosure Act of Non-Discrimination Act of 2009, assured us that you can't be denied health insurance on the basis of pre-existing genetic conditions. Maybe they don't understand it, maybe they don't believe it, got it. But no matter what we do, they're still saying no. So the question is, here's my question. What are the risks and benefits? I've already shared. The big risk of doing eye tests is that around 9 months, you're going to start doing it under anesthesia. So I need everyone to vote. Or every 3 month so if the parents say no, my alternative is then to say, well, I'm going to treat them the way we used to treat children. Kids going to do an eye exam every 3 months, knowing that I'm not happy that I have to put this kid under anesthesia, but that's down the line. Maybe I can convince them down the line to get the genetic test. But right now, we're about to go for the 3 month exam. My question is, are 3 month exams good enough? Or is this child abuse and neglect that they're refusing to do a genetic test? So how many want to say it's good enough? But I need you to vote. All right, how many think it's child abuse or neglect? Okay, only one, right? And so in a sense, in the US clinically, we would just do eye exams every 3 months. And what we would hope is that over time, maybe as infants, as a general pediatrician, that frequent flyers, they come in, at 2 weeks, at 1 month, at 2 months, at 4 months. And we're building our relationship. Maybe I'm building trust. So maybe at some point they're going to say to me, all right, before we have to go through starting the anesthesia, we agree to the eye test. But they may not, and I'm just going to continue to do these eye exams until they're 5 years of age. So almost everyone in this room, with a few exceptions, basically said good enough was good enough. You didn't have to act on what they instead did. Right? So we're already there. Now, if they refuse to come into the eye exam, now we have a kid who has a 50% chance of having an eye cancer. This we might decide is neglectful. And here we might start thinking about getting child protective services involved. Okay, so if we apply that Buchanan and Brock model that I talked about, right? So we're focused, again, in pediatrics, we start with well-being. David's well-being. Determine whether he's at risk and implement early detection if necessary. That would be the ideal. If they don't agree to the genetic testing, parental interest of the decision makers, they're allowed to have genetic privacy for themselves. I got it. The surrogate decision, we all agree it's the parents of the decision maker. The guidance, technically best interest would lead to genetic testing, but we've already agreed that every 3 month exams are good enough. And when should the state intervene? And our real feeling was, if they're really coming in every 3 months and they're sort of following. And we also tell them every time they take a picture with their cell phone, if they notice one pupil is red and one is white, that could be a sign of the cancer. Bring the child in. We're being very compliant about everything but that test. We're just going to accept it. We're going to accept what's good enough. So we've already all agreed that we actually didn't hold David's parents to best interest. Now I want to show you a case and compare what happens in the US versus the UK. This is the case of Charlie Gard, who was born in August 2016 and died in July of 2017, short of his first birthday. So he appeared healthy at birth, but within months, his parents noticed symptoms of muscle weakness and failure to thrive. And by the time they did a workup, it turned out he had an encephalopathic form of mitochondrial DNA depletion syndrome, which I can't say 3 times fast, so I'm going to call it MDDS. And it's caused by a mutation in the RRM2B gene. By the time they figured out what was wrong with him, he was already paralyzed and on a ventilator, because this is a degenerative disease and he's only going to get worse. Now he's on a ventilator, so we're able to keep him alive. There are no models, animal models for MDDS caused by this mutation. There is another form of MDDS that's caused by a PK2 mutation. It's different because it actually doesn't hit neurologically, so it's only the peripheral muscles. It doesn't involve the brain like the RRM2B. And what's important to know that there is a doctor at Columbia University here in New York City who is working on a treatment for children with TK2. It's actually called nucleoside NBT, nucleoside bypass treatment. It's actually pretty mild. It's mostly vitamins and other essential minerals and things of that sort. And the family has done research, and they know that it treats MDDS by the TK2 gene. Never been tried in kids with the genetic mutation that Charlie has, and there's a lot of reasons to really believe it won't help Charlie's case. But they convinced the docs to call Dr. Hirano in New York City, and they're doctors at Great Ormond Street and Dr. Hirano are talking, trying to get themselves to agree on maybe putting Charlie on this therapy, even though it's experimental. It should be done under research protocols, and they get permission, like in this country, to do an off-label therapy and things like that. So again, I want to emphasize that the therapies involved in it are really very mild. They're vitamins. You and I could take it safely. So what happens? On the request, they're talking to the doctor, but then they do a repeat EEG on the 10th of January, which showed frequent electrical seizures, at which time all of the doctors at Great Ormond decided that further treatment would be futile and would only prolong Charlie's suffering. So the doctors then decided that withdrawal of treatment was in Charlie's best interest. His parents said, no, it's in Charlie's best interest to get transferred to Columbia and to try this last resort therapy. And they actually go and raise $1.3 million on a GoFundMe page, and they are ready to take their son to New York. And the doctors say, no, what's best is to have Charlie's ventilator withdrawn and to let Charlie die and not to suffer anymore. And so they went to court. And in the UK courts were instructed to decide what is in Charlie's best interest. So I need you all to vote again. How should the courts decide? Should they say Charlie should go to New York, or should they say withdraw treatment? So in a sense, what do you think is in Charlie's best interest? How many think going to New York is in Charlie's best interest? Okay, and how many think withdrawing treatment is in Charlie's best interest? We're a little bit more divided here. Good. All right, so let's see what happens. So my question, though, as you're thinking about that, is your decision based on Charlie's best interest or something else? Are you sort of saying they should be allowed to go to New York because parents should have the right to make decisions for their kid? Or do you really believe it's in their best interest? So for those of you who want to withdraw treatment, sounds like you think it's in his best interest not to get treatment. For those who want to send him to New York, is it because you think it's in his best interest when this treatment has never been shown to be useful in the condition he has? Or is it that you want to respect parents? So give me a feel. How many are doing because they want to respect? Yeah, go.
My best interest, please.
Oh, it's what's best, not what's good enough. It's the best therapy that we can offer.
The most effective therapy?
Oh,
Is
that's
that what best
so-
interest means?
well, no, right? You're asking a great question. It's what is in this child's best interest? So now we have to think about what is the child's interest? Is the child's interest only health interest, or does the child have other interests as well? We're actually focused here in the case of child's medical best interest. So we are saying what is the most effective therapy for this child? Now, we don't actually have any data to think this therapy is going to be effective, but half of us are willing to send them to New York. So my question is, are we doing it because we think it's best medically effective, or are we doing it because we want to respect parents?
One question I ask is, what is the suffering we're trying to prevent, right?
Well, the question is whether he's really suffering, because
Yeah.
we talked about this at dinner last night, and what does it mean to suffer and things of that sort. Yep, we're going to come back to all of that. So here are 3 different ways of approaching this, okay? Prong 1 is going to say the parents should be guided by best interest, and the state should intervene when their actions are not in Charlie's best interest. So best interest is both the guidance and the intervention. Prong 2 is we should be guided by best interest, but we should intervene when the parents' decisions cross some threshold that we call abuse and neglect. And the third prong is going to be that parents are held to promoting their child's basic interests, and that we should intervene when they fail to promote their basic interests. And we're going to get to all three of those and see what conclusions, and then go back to how US versus UK would handle Charlie Gard. Okay, so let's start with best interest as both guidance and intervention. And this is really the UK model, but I'm going to actually give you two American bioethicists who have advocated for this. Okay, so the first one is Loretta Kopelman. She wrote an important article called "The Best Interest Standard is Threshold, Ideal, and Standard of Reasonableness." So she says best interest is a threshold for intervention and judgment. And she says it's a two-step process. First, you have to determine that some threshold cutoff has been reached, that they're not acting best. And once you get to that, then the question is, who should make the decisions when the parents fail to act at some threshold of best interest? And then she says, if this threshold has been reached, then we have to determine who's going to determine what's in this child's best interest. So I would argue that her whole argument is about who's the appropriate surrogate. It has nothing to do with best. She then says, well, best interest is an ideal to establish policies, but it shouldn't be taken literally because it's too demanding. And I would say, so is this about intervention? But what does it mean not to take the word best literally? Does it mean good enough? And we've already decided that for many of us, when we talk best, we really don't mean best, we mean good enough. And then she says best interest as a standard of reasonableness. Seek the most advantageous decision given the available options. Then she is, but don't ignore needs and rights of others. And this is about guiding us to seek the most advantage. But if it doesn't require the best because the needs and rights of others are not going to be ignored, then we're still at good enough. And Loretta says, no, we're still at best. And I'm going to object because best has to be understood literally as the best. Good enough is not best. So I don't think her arguments succeed, and I've argued with her on way too many occasions. Thad Pope also says, as guidance, best interest answers what course of treatment is in the child's best interest. And then he says, well, doctors should choose a range of what's best, and parents get to choose. And he says then as intervention, the question is, has the parents abused their discretion in determining the course, meaning have they reached some threshold where clinicians or the government should intervene? But then he says, I don't really mean that. The decision to intervene shouldn't just be based on abuse. It should be based on abuse and not mere disagreement. So if we don't agree with the parents, but their decision is but not really abusive, then we shouldn't intervene. So he's back to good enough. So even though they're both claiming that they're arguing that parents should be held to best interest standard, neither of them really are, really only holding good enough. And so let's get rid of this notion that we're using best interest as either a guidance or an intervention. So I'm done with best interest. All right. So Doug Diekema accepts that. He goes, okay, so we want guidance as best interest, but we want to only intervene when we get to harm and abuse. And here's what he writes. Although seeking the best interests of all children represents a laudable goal and is a valid basis on which to make recommendations, it does not represent the best means for determining when one must turn to the state to limit parental action. In other words, best interest is an ideal we should all aspire to, but the real question is, when should the state get involved? And even though parents often make good enough decisions, we're not hitting that threshold. And the only line that's really important is, when should the state intervene? And then he writes, although seeking the best interest, I already read that, supporters therefore modify best interest to mean the range of appropriate decision that a parent might make on behalf of a child, intervene only when parental decisions reach a threshold of harm. And so we're not trying for what's best, just what's good enough. You won't disagree with that. And then he says, in the US, we do. I want to just keep going back to this works, thinking about best interest as an ideal. And so we can use Doug Diekema and this harm threshold is when to intervene, but it doesn't actually tell us how parents should actually be acting. Because if best interest is merely an ideal, it is sort of allowing for good enough treatment. And Buchanan and Brock, the authors of this textbook that I want to use, they actually acknowledge that. They actually write, best interest is to serve only as an ideal, not as a strict and literal requirement. Erica Salter has written a nice piece where she says it's not even clear what interest we're referring to. Getting back to your question, what do we mean by best interest, right? We're not just referring to best. She says, are we talking about their short-term medical interest or their long-term medical interest? Are they allowed to consider other regarding interests as well as their own interests? And are parents allowed to think beyond medical best interest and think about some of the social, economic, psychological, emotional, religious interests that a child may have or may develop and have? And I'll actually add, if we're throwing out best interest, I would actually say that parents have obligations to their other children as well as their own legitimate interests. Back to that notion that Buchanan and Brock told us, they're allowed to consider parental interest. And so they are allowed to not be held to a best interest because they're allowed to consider all these other interests. So if we're not going to hold them to the guidance principle of best, David Winnicott, a psychiatrist from the 1950s, I want to say, 1953, talked about the good enough mother. He was really into the good enough standard, trying to get parents to stop feeling totally guilty for not doing everything that good housekeeping or Dr. Spock was telling them to do. Lynn Gillum from Australia talked about the zone of parental discretion, meaning we have what's best, and we have that line of abuse and neglect, like Deacon wants, but there's this fuzzy gray zone, or I colored it yellow here, which is the zone of parental discretion is good enough. And so what we're really focusing on is that line, when do we get the state involved? And that's only at abuse and neglect. And again, that yellow box is really where David was, right? We're doing those eyes exams every 3 months. So my PhD thesis was about a framework that I called constrained parental autonomy. I wanted a single principle. My problem with best interest and harm and neglect was that fuzzy area. And fuzzy areas, it's hard to know when people are within the fuzzy area or when they fall below the line. So I wanted one principle that would serve as both a guidance and an intervention, and I called it promoting the child's basic interests. The parents have an obligation to ensure that all of their child's basic interests are fulfilled, and we only intervene when we violate those basic interests. So all those good enough are totally accepted because they're just promoting the basic interest and not expected to be doing what's best. And it had both a negative and a positive component. A negative component which holds universally. We all have certain obligations to all children and not just our own. We have an obligation that prohibits the abuse, neglect, and exploitation of all children. In contrast, parents or very specific individuals have only adults who stand in particular relationships with a child have positive obligations to provide their child with basic interests, the good skills, liberties, and opportunities necessary to become autonomous adults capable of devising and implementing their own life plan. So another way to look at it using the Buchanan and Brock framework is that the guidance principle, parents are expected to promote their child's basic interests, and we should intervene when they fail to promote their child's basic interests. So why do I like this principle? Again, I think one principle, the question is, are they violating or are they fulfilling basic interests? Easy to know when we've crossed the line. And because we're only asking them to provide for their child's basic interests, we're actually acknowledging that they may have other interests. Parents have their own interests, but they also might have interests of their other children. So in the case of David, the child at risk for eye cancer, every 3 months are consistent with his basic interests. We're trying to prevent his eye cancer. In the case of Charlie Gard, respect for parental request for this nucleoside therapy is consistent with his basic interest. It's good enough, particularly because it was really a pretty mild, not going to harm him in any way. So that's how I've taken those slides, right? And so in the UK, though, best interest actually does, that prong one, serve as guidance and intervention. So even though the docs might have said that sending him to New York was a reasonable decision, they said it doesn't matter because what's best for Charlie is to have his treatment withdrawn. So they went to court and the courts agreed with the docs, so treatment's going to get withdrawn. Now it's interesting, the lawyers then said, maybe we have it wrong in this country. Maybe what we really should be focusing is on harm. We all agree that this NBT isn't going to harm Charlie, so why not let Charlie get that? And the court's answer was, our obligation is to do what's best for Charlie, and what's best is to have the treatment withdrawn. Better than the request for parents asking for experimental treatment. Now, I have to say that in this country, we would only intervene if we thought the parent's decision was causing much harm or failing to promote their child's basic interest. In fact, I would argue that in this country, if the parent said to us, I want to transfer the kid to New York, Dr. Hirano has agreed to it, send them to New York and get the NBT, we would all just transfer this child. Anybody not transferring Charlie from this hospital? Right? Okay, so all of us, all right, good enough. So the takeaway, in the UK, the courts ruled that withdrawal was in Charlie's best interest, treatment was withdrawn, and Charlie died shortly thereafter. As I said, in the US, he would have never gone to court. And that's it. So it really is important when I say that I really don't believe in best interest. I don't, but they do in the UK, and I have lots of cases in many different areas, from genetic testing, from treatment decisions like this, etc. And there's a lot of overriding of parental discretion, something we wouldn't really do in this country. We can talk about that. I want to, with 10 more minutes, talk about sort of taking what these theories would mean, because the fact is that not everybody's an only child. How many here are oldest or only children? You're not oldest or only children. Oh, wow. Good. All right. So I'm a youngest. And I know that to be president of the United States, you have to be an oldest. There are many places where just being the oldest, you want to be a Rhodes Scholar, or like 90% are first or only children. So I have a little bit of a complex about being a youngest child. And I know that. So I want to think a little bit about the family and what it means to have siblings. So there's no simple definition of the family. They come in many shapes and variable size. In the 20th century, in the US, there was a focus on the nuclear family, but in other cultures and in other time periods in the US, including right now, there's a greater focus on extended families and blended families. The definition of family has also changed over time with changing laws about who can marry, the availability and acceptability of divorce, and changing social mores about bearing and raising children outside of marriage. And some also distinguish between biological families, families of origin, which may not be biological, whether due to adoption of the use of assisted reproductive technologies, versus families of choice. So I get it. We can't even agree what a family is. When philosophers talk about family, which is really rare, if you look through all of philosophical literature, when they'll often talk about family obligations. They'll talk about what parents may owe their children, like Jane English, or what children may owe their parents. But philosophers who think about the family often ignore siblings and the question of whether there are sibling obligations. And part of the reason is because they're involuntary relationships, and so therefore they don't arise out of contracts or promises, so we just don't have any idea what to do with them. But psychologically, as some of you have talked to me over the last day and a half, sibling relationships are often the longest relationships of our lives and can have a strong impact on who we are. And in fact, many of us feel some degree of obligation to our siblings, or we're told that we have obligations by our parents to our siblings and things of that sort. So siblings are this sort of interesting thing. I just want you to know yesterday was National Sibling Day. It's actually not a federal holiday. It's a national holiday. It was only acknowledged by Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama, not by Trump or Biden. Nice little piece about it on NPR. Come on, go past it. I also thought this was interesting, looking at what we think of as the ideal family size. And you can see that in 2023, most wanted either 2 or 3 children, which is changing demographics. You can see over time, families used to be much larger. They've gotten smaller. But more often than not, it's about a 2 or 3 child. It's rarely about the single child. And siblings, just like families come in all these different shapes and sizes, siblings come in different shapes and sizes. That they can share 2 genetic parents, they can share 1, they may share none if they're adopted or they are step siblings. Some siblings are close in age, you can be twins, you can even be identical twins, but you could also be born years or even decades apart. Some siblings are raised in the same household, some aren't. Some share a room, some siblings have never lived under the same roof. And then we can start getting into artificial insemination by donor. And in fact, there's this whole notion now of dibblings, which is that if you're women who choose the same sperm donor from a sperm bank, these kids go on to something like 23andMe. They figure out they're half siblings with 40 other kids around the country, and some of them get together. I am not getting into dibblings. I'm sticking to siblings in the more traditional way. I don't care if you're genetically related, adopted, you're half siblings, but I'm ignoring the dibblings. Okay. And I'm going to talk about, am I my brother's keeper? And when what is best for one child is not best for his or her sibling. And so I'm going to talk about the Joneses, and they're a married couple, and they have 3 biological children being raised in a shared household. The kids' names are Carol, David, and Alex. Alex is 8, and he has significant physical and language delays of unknown etiology, and the pediatrician recommends more intensive physical, behavioral, and occupational therapy. The best program for children like Alex is 4 hours away by car. The parents are considering moving the family, even though they know that staying in their current home is better for their older children. So David, 11, and Carol, 14, explicitly object. They don't want to leave their friends, their church, and their high-ranking school to move to another town, which doesn't offer a lot of advanced placement courses. Mr. and Mrs. Jones acknowledge that their current school district is much better for Alex's siblings. Right? So when we think about pediatric decision making, we have this nice box. I already said a triangle was problematic because we had parent, child, and doctor. But no, it's Diet Coke in the Greek bag. Thanks. If we have more than one child, we have this problem because the parents are making decisions for both, and they might have a conflict of interest, right? And so all of a sudden, that whole model that I've been talking about thank you very much, gets messed up when there's more than one child, because the doctor and parents are, in a sense, they have other interests. Who's really their primary patient? And can you care for 2 patients, quote, equally when what's best for one is not necessarily best for the others, right? So what happens when you think about siblings? Those underlying principles, well-being, self-determination, and parental interest, you kind of wrap them and talk it all about whether you're allowed to take in sibling interests, right? The surrogate decision-making. Do parents have a conflict of interest when making decisions on what's best for child 1 is not best for child 2, right? And then how do you intervene? And in fact, you kind of realize there might be, like sibling stem cell was a place where they thought the state should intervene. That parents, they acknowledge this conflict of interest that parents would have. It's the only time they ever deal with siblings in that book. Really upsetting to me. So is it ethical for the parents to compromise Alex's cognitive, physical behavior, and occupational development in order for siblings to have more robust educational opportunities? So it's not only that we're dealing with, one, we're focusing on Alex's health interests, we're talking about his kids' educational and spiritual interests. We got apples and oranges, and we focus so far on what's in the child's medical best interest, but are you allowed to compromise medical best interests for some of these other interests for some families, which may be more important than their medical best interest? And so how should parents make decisions if it's going to have a negative interest on either the child's health or other interests, right? And so what should the child do for Alex? If they don't move, should the state intervene because they're doing what's worst for their older 2 kids, right? And yet, if they move, they're benefiting Alex, they're doing what's in his medical best interest, harming their kids. If they don't move, they're benefiting their other 2 kids. Alex is still going to get therapy. He's just not getting the best therapy. And I've already argued that they don't have to give him the best therapy. They only have to get good enough therapy. So the answer is the parents can do either. And none of us would say that one of those decisions was abusive or neglectful. And we could imagine being in that circumstance and not agreeing on what should be done. And we could imagine making a decision and still having some regret and distress because we're not really sure. Should we maximize one child's therapies, which may or may not work, the other child's health, educational, religious, cultural, which again, may be values that they don't value 20 years later. So there's no way of knowing prospectively which is the right answer in that case. And so in this country, we're really clear, parental discretion, but either way, it's acceptable. We hope you've thought about all of those issues, but in the end, we're not going to push the parents. And so my answer in the case is, well, Alex, parents should protect Alex's health interests. No obligation to promote the best rehab. Parents have an obligation to provide Alex with at least good quality rehab. The parents don't have the obligation to stay though in their current house because of the older siblings' preferences. Even if they think it is in their older siblings' best interest, they can move because the fact is the other schools are going to be good enough as well, right? So in one way or the other, for some children, we're doing what's good enough, and for the other child, we may be doing what's best. People routinely choose to use in-network healthcare providers and institutions if the best one is out of network. It costs more. In a sense, we are always negotiating what's in the child's medical best interest versus other interests. And finally, parents may elect to provide Alex with speech therapy available through the public schools, even though more frequent and perhaps higher quality therapy is available privately, right? So parents make financial decisions and balance it against their child's medical, quote, best interests. So why do we respect such wide parental interest? And in one sense, I always say, like, well, how could we not? The other way would be draconian. We'd have to get the courts involved in a myriad of decisions where we actually believe in that zone of parental and familial privacy. And Buchanan and Brock provide 4 reasons why we should give parents wide discretion. They say because in most cases, parents care deeply about their child's welfare, know them and their needs best, and are better able to ensure the decisions serve their child's welfare. Parents bear the consequences of their choices. That's not to say that the child doesn't as well, but these are their arguments. The right of parents within limits to raise their children according to their own values and to seek to transmit these values to their children. And finally, because the family is a valuable institution, and to preserve it requires some degree of freedom and privacy within limits to make decisions about the welfare of its incompetent members. I added a 5th in my work, which is we allow parents to make intrafamilial trade-offs, provided it doesn't sacrifice the basic interests of any child, right? They can't move and not send their kids to school. They can't stay where they're living and not get this child some therapies, at least somehow, right? So they have to promote the basic interest, even if they're not doing what's best. So what's the takeaway from the Jones? Parents are not held to a best interest, but we already knew that from Charlie Gard. Parents have the authority to balance a child's health interests against other interests and needs of the child in the context of a holistic or a biopsychosocial approach. Parents have the authority to balance a child's health interests against the health or other interests of a sibling, provided the decision doesn't fail to promote the child's basic interests. So I just conclude with parents are not, and I would argue morally should not be held to a best interest. Physicians should promote the child's medical best interest, understanding that sometimes other factors will weigh in and that parents may not make a decision in the child's best interest. Although parents have presumptive authority for their children and are given wide discretion, parental autonomy is not absolute. That original slide, adults are allowed to withhold and withdraw all treatment, including life-saving treatment. Parents have a much more circumscribed what are reasonable and acceptable decisions that they make for their kids. Children have rights that require third parties, clinicians, and or the state to intervene if their parents' decision falls below some threshold. And if you remember that notion of basic interest, and that we had both positive and negative, while parents may be focused on having to do everything, we as a community have obligations to children as well, and particularly as healthcare providers, have obligation to those children in our clinic. But as vaccines point out, sometimes to the children even outside our clinic doors. And finally, further examination of family obligations and healthcare decision-making is needed and should include a discussion of the duties, if any, of children to their parents, of siblings to each other across the lifespan, and to family members beyond the nuclear family. So with that, happy to take questions. Kyle.
I think your last case about the 2 kids who are typically developing and are thinking about EP courses, and the 3rd kid is not typically developing and you're thinking about therapies is a really great context to think about disability and the parents' obligations to meet their child's basic needs in the context of children who have disabilities. So I was just thinking about, you know, we're a rural state, we have families that live in rural places, and it may not be the decision between good enough therapy and the best therapy, which we think we do here, But it could be, actually, some therapies are not gone, right? Like feeding therapy, I bet you need to come to downtown to get that. If you're staying in someplace in Kentucky, you're not gonna get it, period. It's not happening. So, but we generally tolerate parents deciding to stay living in a rural area and not getting those things. And we also tolerate parents not bankrupting themselves to get their child good things, right? So, yeah, I just wonder what you think about in that kind of dynamic. Are we sort of permitting a type of discrimination against the disabled children?
Yeah, I don't think so. And part of it is it's not just weighing the child versus the other. It's also the parents are forced to move to the city and their livelihood is on a farm and you bankrupt the whole family. I mean, then we start getting into can they afford to feed anybody in the family type thing. So I think we have to acknowledge, right? We have to do justice questions in an imperfect world, which is what we live in. So I think that's the first thing. And the second thing is, even though they might not have feeding therapies there, they're still getting some degree of care here. And how much can we teach them? And now with Zoom and being able to do medical, I mean, again, not ideal and not as good as he would get if he lived around the corner from his children's hospital. But I think we just have to work with families and acknowledge that parents are really trying. So Winnicott's whole book was sort of really in reaction to people who were just always saying that if parents didn't do this, they were harming their children, and they weren't. You know, breast might be best, but there are plenty of children who did just fine being raised on formula and things of that sort. We have to stop guilting all of our parents all the time. And it's sort of an attitude I've taken as a pediatrician that they're trying. And there might be really other values that are really important for that child with disabilities and living in a close-knit community where they have shared values. And so if one of those parents gets sick, that other family members or other friends are willing to come and help take care of that child, which they might not get in a large city. So no, I don't think we're discriminating against the disabled.
So this was fantastic, thank you. I wondered if there's a distinction. You're distinguishing between best interests of the child and then other interests that might compete with it or need to be balanced with it. And I wonder if there's a distinction between the latter category and an interpretation or a conception of what's best for the child, quite independently of what the parents might want for themselves or the other siblings might want for themselves. There might be disagreement between physicians and parents about what constitutes best for the child and even what constitutes basic interests for the child. And I wonder how you would engage conflict about those questions.
Right. Well, so that is the UK case, right? The parent said what's best for this child, and the court said, and so that's what's fascinating about the Charlie Gard case, is that the courts get to say, yeah, that your decision is good, but we the courts, we third parties can look at the situation and determine that something is objectively best, right? Whereas I'm taking a much more subjectively best approach and acknowledging that both of us may think X and Y is best, but since I don't have to get the best, I can ignore it. So that's the first part. Second part is more complicated because now you're saying, well, what if we don't even agree what's fulfilling the basic interest? In the sense, that's what Kyle was also asking. If you really don't have those therapies, is it good enough, even though it's really problematic because some of those therapies may not exist? And so I get in trouble if I start saying, well, intentions matter because we can't measure intentions. I get that. And so then the question that we have to get to that is, at what point are we failing to reach those basic interests? And part of it is, like I was giving ways of trying to get around the fact that they might not have those services. If they come in twice a year, get educated, and we can do a couple of Zoom calls, is that at least not violating their basic interests? So I do think probably that intentions have some degree of play, but I think that's much harder to justify than just try to create some degree of we're really looking for violating basic interests. Does that start to answer? I mean, it's a complicated question you're asking me.
Yes, I guess I'm trying to imagine, like, what if the parents think that the child's basic interests include, I don't know, something, supernatural, and, they have to be have to be baptized on a particular day and this can't be done. I don't wanna.
Well, no, because you see, so that starts getting interesting because I am focused on the healthcare setting. And I would argue, so you've gone beyond the healthcare setting. And so then we start getting into what are parents' responsibilities, and we do allow for a huge amount of discretion for parents, both here and in the UK. Sort of fascinating that we do put health on some degree of a pedestal. So the supernatural would be, I mean, part of it would be as long as it's not harming their child medically, so it's tolerated, right? Olivia?
I was just trying to think through this, like, best interest of the boy in the UK who, potentially could come to New York. What if, what if there was, I mean, presumably the doctor and the parents thought there was a chance that with this therapy, he would get better or recover, or there would be some sort of benefit to him, right? So I'm surprised, well, I'm trying to understand, like, what would it take? Like, would it take, well, this experimental research, there's would it have to be a 20% chance that he could live an extra 5 years, or where did it fall away from being the best option?
Yeah, so the actual case makes it really obvious where it was. So Gerardo kept saying, we'll take him. And the British courts got really annoyed at one point, as well as the docs at Great Ormond Street, because Gerardo had actually never examined the kid. He said, if you're so adamant about it, why don't you come over here and look at the kid? And as well as Columbia starting to find out that he was offering a therapy which was experimental, never been tried on this kid, couldn't even necessarily he could not be enrolled in the research study because he had the wrong gene, so he didn't meet the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So this would be an off-label for a research study for a non-national, and 1.3 million doesn't go very far in Columbia Medical. So his institution wasn't very happy. So the final result was he finally gets over to the UK because the courts are saying, if you really think it's in his best interest, we want you to examine him and look us in the eye. And he gets over there and he goes, well, when you really look at the EEG and you look at the most recent CT, yeah, probably won't work. So he sort of backs that down. And it's at that point where the parents become accepting of what's going on. In the meantime, during that 5-week or 6-week period, parents not only went through the UK courts, they went to the, that was when the UK was still part of the EU. So they actually went to the European Court of Human Rights and everything else. I mean, they really went up the chain as far as they could in trying to get, but once they no longer had a doctor on their side, they realized their cause was lost. But your question is, at what point does, how successful does a treatment have to be where the courts, at least the courts in the UK, shouldn't override a parent? And it's a great question. It's so in the US, a 20% chance would be good enough for the parents. I'm not sure that it would be in the UK because the courts could say no overall. So we are dealing with just very different cultural. I mean, I spent a couple of months in the UK as a medical student, and I remember thinking, and I spent a month in a Spanish hospital, and I speak Spanish as very much a second language and non-culturally. And I remember it was easier to be a medical student in Spanish because I knew there were language barriers. So when something didn't make sense, I knew to say, I don't get it. But in the UK, I thought we spoke the same language. I thought we had the same culture. And boy, I just kept getting hit over the head about how different things were. So that's why I don't want to talk about what they would actually do in the UK. In the US, 20% would be good enough. Yes.
So, make a comment and then a question. The Jones family example, I think we forget that there are all sorts of unintended consequences, unanticipated consequences. I can't think of a single family I've taken care of who, let's say the first child had Down syndrome, and then they had 2 other kids, who 20 years later, the parents would not say, all of us benefited from that child being in our family. But the 11-year-old and the 14-year-old would have never said that at the time.
Correct.
But they would say it 10 years later.
Yeah.
The other thing I was going to ask is about the best interest. I just have a really hard time with that because I think it's so black and white, especially the scenario 1, which is either red or green. beneficence and non-maleficence is how I usually think of these situations, and they're always intertwined. And non-maleficence doesn't mean abuse and neglect. It just means there's other consequences that everybody suffers that we have to calculate.
Yeah, so I like those comments. Yes, I do think best interest does make things black and white, which is why I started at adding the yellow into the green, right? Best and good enough, because that at least gives us a zone of discretion type of stuff. The problem with what you said, because I like it, but we're left with policy. And at some point we have to say you either crossed the line or you didn't. So at some point it has to become yes, no. And the fact is it rarely does. We usually will negotiate with families, we'll compromise with families. When those of us in this room who are clinicians, we know we don't see it as black and white. Even if we see it as black and white, the last thing we want to do is get the courts involved. So we will negotiate and, as I said, make compromises until it gets to some point where they've crossed some threshold, right? And so I do think at some point it has to have that black line, even though we may have dipped into it multiple times before we finally say, all right, we're done. We can't continue to work with this family. So I do think, to the credit of most clinicians, we don't want to invoke the intervention principle. We are really willing to work with families and get our colleagues involved, the chaplains, the nurses, the child life, the social workers, everybody, to try to get this family to come up with a good enough decision. No, I'm past time. Should I call it quits? So thank you very much, and I'm happy to stay and answer questions.